All right, before we get into the normal and dissolve and behind and clear options that we have available, let's take a note here that these blending modes are broken up into different sections. Notice that there are lines dividing these apart, and this means that we can quickly determine where we are without just having to stumble around and try to remember, is overlay part of the lightning or contrast? Well, we'll know that it's separate. So what are these sections? Essentially, you have the normal section, which is just transparencies, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. We have the darkening section, and if you'll remember, we have used multiply a few times during the semester to knock out whites, but we also have darken and color burn and linear burn and darken color in here. All those will act as though you're casting a shadow with the image in one way or another. And we'll talk about those coming up. We have the lightning section, and the lightning section has things like screen, which we've used to knock out blacks. It also has lighten, color dodge, linear dodge add, and lighten color. We have the contrast modes, which we've used for overlay, and back on the Smart Object project, you'll remember that we used a 50% gray overlay layer. When we painted with white, it got lighter, but when we painted with black, it got darker. And the reason is that a contrast mode will make things lighter in the light areas and darker in the dark areas. Now, light and dark are determined by the color that's being used. Essentially, if you have a brightness, anything above 50%, so 51 and up, will essentially lighten things, and anything below 50%, essentially 49 to 0, will darken things on our brightness. Oh, actually, yeah, we do go to 0. And if it's at 50%, we'll recall that we did do a 50% fill. Overlay will just ignore it, we'll knock it out. And so that's how the contrast modes work, with perhaps the exception of hard mix, which is a little different. We'll talk about that in a bit. And speaking of difference, we also have the inversion / cancellation modes. And these can do things like invert the colors below. You can use things like subtract or divide to cancel the pixels below. So I guess we could call this the inversion / cancellation area. Subtract will clip things to black, divide will clip things to white, and we'll talk about how it does that in a bit. And then you have, lastly, the component section of your blending modes, which are hue and saturation, color, and luminosity. Now, if we were to bring open our color picker, you'll recall that hue, saturation, and brightness are three things that you need in degrees for hue, since it's essentially rotating through the rainbow. Percent for saturation and brightness, which is just the amount of color that's going in and how bright it is. So where does the term color come from on this blending mode if we only have those three? Well, color is the combination of hue and saturation together, and that's how we get color. And of course, we've got the luminosity. Now we're going to cover each of these, so let's start with normal and dissolve. Actually, we'll also need to cover our behind and clear, so I'll make a mental note of that. Normal is the simplest one. Let's say we have a white square. We have opacity, and if we turn it down, it will simply lower the opacity of the layer you're on, allowing the layer below to show through. If you go to fill, you'll notice that the same thing happens, which begs the question what fill is versus opacity, and we'll get into that once we get to the darken modes. We'll talk about what those do and how they handle differently. Essentially, the formula for this is pretty straightforward. Make that a little bigger. Okay, so this is essentially a percent-based pixel mix, and let me show you what that means. Let's say that we have our active layer, in this case it's layer 3 that I'm painting on right now, and we have the background layer, which in this case is that layer 0, those autumn leaves, that I should really just name autumn leaves, but I have not yet done that. And we have this percentage right here. We'll call this our alpha percentage, because transparency is essentially an alpha mask. So what we do with this is take the alpha mask and multiply it by our active layer. Now, you don't have to memorize these formulas. I just like to talk about them a few times, and just a few of them. I probably won't go over all of them. It's so that later on, if you're thinking about these, it will give you a framework to work with, and it will be important when we get to multiply. Remember, there aren't any tests in my course. I'm not going to ask that you memorize these things, and many people don't like mathematics after having some bad high school experiences, and so they'll just ignore this part, and that's fine. This is just so that if you need to, they're here. So we have our active layer multiplied by our alpha transparency. So in this case, at 100%, we have 100% of the alpha layer, so it doesn't matter really what's going on past this, because it will be 1 minus that alpha, which is a percent, times our background layer. So in other words, if we had 100% for alpha, we would have 100 times A, which would plus 1 minus, and sorry, 100, that would be 1.00 times A, because that's 100%, and we'd have 1 minus 1.00 times B. So what we would have is essentially 1 times A is A, and then 0 times B is 0. So we just have our active layer and nothing else. All right, let me erase this, or better yet, let me just make a new layer over that. Here we go. So if we came in with 50% for our alpha, what would we get? Well, it's 0.5 times our active layer plus 1 minus 0.5, because that's 50%, times our background layer. So that would result in essentially the same thing as half of our alpha layer plus half of our background layer. And let's see if that's true. 50%. If I can get 50%. Well, sure enough, if I were to click on one of these with my color picker, we'd see this pure black is now 50%. So it's dropped down. And what about this from our previous layer? Well, let's click on it. Sure enough, it's dropped down. Okay, so that one's straightforward enough. Let's talk about what on earth dissolve is doing. Crank this back up to 100%. Before we get into dissolve, let me do one thing real quick. I'm going to add a layer mask, and then in this layer mask, I'm going to fill it with some noise. So I'm going to go to Filter, Noise, and then let's use just add noise for this example, and we'll do Gaussian. Okay, so we'll turn off this other layer. We have now some percentage of the background showing through according to the noise. Now, let me get rid of this. Or actually, let me just deactivate it for a moment and come to dissolve. Let's switch this to dissolve and lower the opacity to 50%. Doesn't this look familiar? It's having about the same effect that we saw before. What this essentially does is create a certain amount of noise and then knock out one of those two colors that are being produced in the noise. So let's say that we were producing just black and white noise. We could choose, say, black to hide it and then white to show it, much like we did over here. And in fact, if I went one step further, I did not mean to do that. If we went one step further and actually did a threshold adjustment on this, so it was flat out black and white with no gray, we'll see that it's even more similar to the other step. So it's just adding a percentage of noise. Some of it is black, some of it is white, and then it shows whatever is below it. So if you think of it that way, you can decrease opacity, and the more you decrease it, the more black noise will be added in and essentially make it vanish, and that's it. It would be the same thing as filling this with more and more noise in our mask layer until there's nothing left. So that's how dissolve works. All right, so I told you I'd also show you real fast how behind and clear works. So I'm just going to make a new layer real quick. And let's just draw a smiley face. All right, straightforward enough. Let's say that we wanted to fill in that smiley face. So we just kind of get a big brush and then, oops, that's right. It doesn't work like that. But it could if you switch the mode to behind. What behind will do is paint and fill in only where there's transparency. So essentially you can color stuff in a destructive fashion. And this can be a lot of fun in a lot of cases, but it generally isn't all that useful unless you're trying to fill in little spots of stuff and you don't want to accidentally cover up other things. So let me just do a quick paperclip and voila, it shows up behind it. So that brings up the next question, what is clear? Well, this used to be more important. Essentially, it turns your brush into an eraser. If it were in normal mode, then it would just come in straight away. But on clear mode, it will behave exactly like an eraser. And one last thing, if we were to set this to dissolve, you'd wonder, well, what's the point without opacity? You'd have to crank it down and you're painting in like weird noise colors on things, right? Going to pick a slightly more vibrant color that might stick out on, there we go, these orange leaves a little bit better. You can see this noise showing up, right? Well, there's another thing you can do with this that's a lot of fun. If we crank the opacity back up to 100%, you can decrease the hardness so you get a nice fuzzy brush, and look how it will behave. It produces this sort of staticky splatter, similar to the effects that we got back when we were creating airbrushes. So this can be a cheap way to quickly make an airbrush-like effect if you don't want to fiddle with all of your brushes. All right, and so those are your normal modes. And from here, we're going to get into the darken modes, and this is where things get really interesting. See you next video.